The social worker's car pulled up to the two-story brick house on Maple Avenue one chilly October morning. In the backseat, a small boy held his backpack close to his chest, his warm brown eyes taking in the perfectly manicured lawn and the shiny SUV in the driveway. This was his fourth foster home in 2 years, and he'd learned not to get his hopes up too high. "Remember what we talked about, Miss Thompson," the social worker said gently as she helped him out of the car. "Mrs. Wilson has fostered many children before. Try to give it a chance, okay?" The boy nodded silently, his grip tightening on his worn backpack, the only constant companion through all his moves. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a tall woman in her early 50s wearing pressed khakis and a blue cardigan. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her smile seemed practiced, like something from a real estate agent's headshot. "Welcome, welcome," she called out, her voice carrying across the front yard with theatrical warmth. As they stepped inside, the boy's eyes widened at the sight of the grand entrance hall. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, and family photos lined the walls. Mrs. Wilson, her husband, and their 3 children beaming in various vacation spots. He noticed there weren't any pictures of foster kids, despite Miss Thompson saying she'd fostered many before. "Your room is all ready," Mrs. Wilson said, her smile never wavering as she spoke to Miss Thompson rather than looking at the boy. "We're so happy to help out. You know how my husband and I feel about giving back to the community." There was something in her tone that made the boy's stomach twist slightly. While Miss Thompson and Mrs. Wilson handled paperwork in the kitchen, the boy stood awkwardly in the living room, afraid to sit on the pristine white couch. He could hear other kids somewhere in the house, laughter and the sound of a video game drifting down from upstairs. His heart ached to join them, to feel normal for once. All set. Miss Thompson emerged from the kitchen, her kind face trying to mask her own uncertainty. She knelt down to the boy's level. "I'll check in next week, okay? You have my number if you need anything." She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, and he fought the urge to grab her hand and beg her not to leave. The moment the front door closed behind Miss Thompson, something shifted in the air. Mrs. Wilson's smile disappeared like a switch had been flipped. "Right," she said, her voice now clipped and businesslike. "Let me show you where you'll be staying." Instead of heading upstairs where the laughter was, Mrs. Wilson led him to a door near the kitchen. It opened to reveal stairs leading down to the basement. The boy's heart sank as they descended into the cooler air below. While the basement was finished, it had none of the warmth of the upper floors. A twin bed with a thin blanket sat in one corner, a dresser with a loose handle in another, and a small desk that had clearly seen better days completed the setup. "Bathrooms through that door," Mrs. Wilson said, pointing to a small half bath. "House rules are simple. You'll keep to yourself down here when you're not at school. Meals are at 7, 12, and 6. Don't be late, or you'll miss them. My children's rooms are strictly off limits. Any questions?" The boy shook his head, still clutching his backpack. "Good. Get settled then. Dinner's in an hour." She turned and headed back upstairs, her footsteps echoing on the wooden steps. Once alone, the boy sat on the bed, which creaked under even his slight weight. Through the small window near the ceiling, he could see feet walking past on the sidewalk outside. The sound of children laughing upstairs seemed even more distant now. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out his most precious possession, a dog-eared copy of his favorite science book. Opening to the chapter about stars, he lost himself in stories of distant galaxies and burning suns, trying to ignore the cold feeling settling in his chest. He'd survived tough homes before, he reminded himself. He just had to stay strong and keep his head down. Upstairs, he could hear Mrs. Wilson's voice, warm and loving, calling her children to help set the table for dinner. The contrast between her two voices, the sugary one for show and the cold one for him, told him everything he needed to know about what life would be like in this new home. Life in Mrs. Wilson's house quickly fell into a harsh routine. Every morning, the boy woke up an hour earlier than the other kids, making his own cold breakfast from the few items he was allowed to eat, usually just plain cereal and milk that was close to expiring. He learned to eat quickly and clean up any evidence that he'd been in the kitchen before the rest of the family came downstairs. The walk to school became his favorite part of the day. While Mrs. Wilson's children rode in the warm SUV, he walked the mile and a half in all weather. But he didn't mind. Those 30 minutes were the only time he felt truly free. He'd watch other families walking together, imagine what it would be like to hold a parent's hand, to laugh about morning cartoons or talk about homework. At school, things weren't much better. While Mrs. Wilson's kids wore new clothes from the mall, he wore whatever she picked up from the discount store's clearance rack. His too short pants and faded shirts made him stick out, and some kids whispered and pointed. During lunch, he sat alone, carefully eating the meager sandwich she packed, always just one slice of cheese between 2 pieces of white bread. Back at the house, he could never bring himself to call it home. He wasn't allowed to join the family in the living room or play in the backyard with the other kids. "You'll mess up the grass," Mrs. Wilson would say, or the neighbors might see. Instead, he spent his afternoons in the basement, doing homework at the wobbly desk. One particularly hard day, he heard the other kids upstairs getting excited about pizza night. The smell of melted cheese and pepperoni drifted down to his basement room, making his stomach growl. But when he went up for dinner, Mrs. Wilson handed him a plate with just a small portion of plain pasta. "The pizza is for family," she said simply, turning back to her children who were happily grabbing slices. The boy learned to find joy in small things. He discovered that the library at school stayed open until 4 p.m., giving him a warm place to read for an hour before heading back. The librarian, a gentle older woman with kind eyes, never asked why he came every day. She just smiled and sometimes left a granola bar on his usual table. Mrs. Wilson's rules grew stranger as time went on. He wasn't allowed to use the washing machine, so he had to wash his clothes by hand in the basement sink. When the other kids had friends over for sleepovers, filled with laughter and the smell of microwave popcorn, he had to stay extra quiet downstairs, as if his very existence might spoil their fun. The hardest part wasn't the cold, or the hunger, or even the loneliness. It was watching Mrs. Wilson transform whenever someone else was around. When teachers or neighbors visited, she'd suddenly remember his existence, calling him sweetie, and patting his head like a beloved pet. She'd tell stories about how she was blessed to help this poor child, and how fostering was her calling in life. The moment they left, the mask would drop, and she'd send him back to his basement without a word. Winter came, bringing new challenges. While the rest of the house stayed toasty warm, the basement grew colder each day. The thin blanket on his bed barely kept out the chill. He started wearing his coat to sleep, pulling it tight around him as he tried to imagine warmer places. During the day, he'd sit on his hands while doing homework, trying to keep his fingers warm enough to hold a pencil. One morning, he found a small crack in the basement window, letting in a bitter draft. When he nervously told Mrs. Wilson, she just shrugged. "We'll fix it in the spring," she said, turning back to help her daughter with a school project. That night, he used his only roll of tape to cover the crack, watching his breath form little clouds in the freezing air. But through it all, he never lost hope. Each night, before falling asleep, he'd look at his science book, dreaming of a future where he could help other kids like him. He promised himself that someday, when he was grown up, he'd make sure no child felt as invisible as he did now. This promise became his North Star, guiding him through the darkest nights in that cold basement room. Everything changed the day Mrs. Wright walked into his 3rd grade classroom. From the moment she started teaching, the boy felt something different in the air. She didn't just teach lessons, she brought them to life. When they studied the solar system, she turned the classroom ceiling into a galaxy using glow-in-the-dark stars. During story time, her voice would rise and fall like music, making even the most boring books sound like adventures. But what really caught the boy's attention was how she looked at every student the same way, with genuine interest and care. She didn't favor the kids with new backpacks or perfect homework folders. In her class, raising your hand was more important than wearing the right clothes. One rainy Tuesday, while other students rushed to recess, Mrs. Wright asked him to stay behind. His heart sank. Usually when teachers did this, it meant trouble. But instead of scolding him, she pulled out a worn blue book from her desk drawer. "I noticed you finished all our class books already," she said with a warm smile. "I thought you might like something more challenging." The book was about famous scientists and their discoveries. That night, hidden under his thin blanket with a flashlight, he read about people who changed the world with their minds, not their money. He learned about a scientist who grew up poor but ended up discovering life-saving medicines. Another came from a family that couldn't afford books, but he became one of the greatest minds in physics. Mrs. Wright started leaving more books on his desk. Advanced science books, math problems that made him think hard, stories about people who beat the odds. She never made a show of it. The books would just appear, like magic, exactly when he needed them most. During lunch breaks, she let him eat in the classroom, casually discussing what he'd read while grading papers. One day, she caught him trying to warm his hands on the classroom radiator before a test. Without saying a word, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a pair of gloves. "I bought these for my nephew," she said casually, "but they're too small for him. Would you like them?" They both knew it wasn't true, but the boy accepted them gratefully, fighting back tears. In class, Mrs. Wright had a special way of building his confidence. When he solved a difficult math problem, she'd ask him to explain his thinking to the class. At first, he spoke so quietly nobody could hear him. But she kept encouraging him, and slowly, he found his voice. Other kids started asking him for help with their work, and for the first time, he felt like more than just the foster kid in the basement. She taught him that learning wasn't just about memorizing facts, it was about understanding the world. When he asked why leaves change colors in fall, she didn't just give him the answer. Instead, she brought in leaves and helped him do experiments to figure it out himself. His eyes lit up when he discovered the hidden colors that were there all along, just waiting to be revealed. The boy started coming to school earlier, helping Mrs. Wright set up the classroom for the day. Sometimes she'd share her morning coffee with him. Actually, it was hot chocolate in a coffee cup, their little secret. During these quiet moments, she'd tell him stories about students she taught who went on to do amazing things, despite starting with nothing. One morning, seeing him shiver in his thin jacket, she told him about her own childhood. "You know," she said, arranging books on shelves, "when I was your age, my family couldn't afford heat either. But I had a teacher who believed in me. She showed me that my brain could take me places my feet couldn't go yet." She looked at him meaningfully. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most important destinations. Despite the cold basement and lonely dinners, school became his sanctuary. Every worksheet was a chance to prove Mrs. Wilson wrong, every book a ticket to somewhere warmer. Mrs. Wright never directly mentioned his home situation. She didn't have to. Instead, she gave him something more valuable than pity. She gave him tools to build his own future. By spring, the boy who barely spoke had become one of the top students in class. While Mrs. Wilson might control his present, Mrs. Wright had shown him that his future was his to shape. Each night, as he read under his blanket, he wasn't just studying. He was building a ladder to climb out of that basement, one page at a time. That winter was the coldest anyone could remember. Snow piled up against the basement window, and the old crack had spread like a spider web across the glass. The boy spent his nights huddled under every piece of clothing he owned, trying to stay warm enough to sleep. His breath came out in white puffs, dancing in the beam of his flashlight as he tried to study. Next door lived an elderly couple who spent most evenings sitting on their porch, regardless of the weather. The husband loved to garden, and even in winter, he'd be out there checking on his covered plants. His wife always had a thermos of hot tea beside her rocking chair. They'd wave to the boy sometimes when he walked to school, and he'd wave back shyly. One particularly brutal night, the temperature dropped below zero. The boy could hear the heating system working overtime upstairs, but barely any warmth reached the basement. He tried wrapping his feet in paper from his school notebook, but nothing seemed to help. His fingers had turned an alarming shade of purple, and he couldn't stop shivering. The next morning, he could barely get out of bed. His joints ached from sleeping curled up so tight, and his throat felt like he'd swallowed glass. But he knew Mrs. Wilson's rule: if you're too sick for school, you're too sick for dinner. So he forced himself up, pulled on his coat with trembling hands, and started his walk to school. He didn't make it far. The elderly neighbor was already out, checking his winter plants, when he saw the boy stumbling on the icy sidewalk. The boy's lips had a bluish tint, and he wasn't wearing any gloves. The ones from Mrs. Wright had finally fallen apart. Without hesitation, the old man helped him into their warm house, where his wife immediately wrapped him in a thick blanket. "Where did you come from, child?" she asked, pressing a mug of hot tea into his shaking hands. "We've never seen you leave through the front door." Through chattering teeth, the boy explained about the basement room. The couple exchanged worried looks as he described his living situation, trying to downplay how bad it really was. But he couldn't hide the truth of what the cold had done to him. His fingers were nearly frostbitten, and when a wife touched his forehead, she gasped at how cold his skin felt. "This isn't right," she whispered to her husband. "No child should live like this." While the wife called the school to let them know he'd be late, her husband made him eat a proper breakfast: hot oatmeal with brown sugar and real butter, toast with jam, and scrambled eggs that steamed on the plate. The boy tried to eat slowly, to be polite, but he was so hungry he nearly cried at the taste of warm food. That same morning, the couple made 2 more calls. One to Child Protective Services and another to the local news station. They'd seen too many foster kids come and go from Mrs. Wilson's house over the years, never staying long, never playing outside like her own children did. But seeing this boy, nearly frozen, trying to walk to school rather than miss a day, that was the last straw. The response was swift. By afternoon, social workers and investigators were at Mrs. Wilson's house. They found the basement room's temperature was well below legal requirements for living spaces. The crack in the window, the lack of proper heating, the thin blanket, it all painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Wilson tried to explain it away. "He likes it cool," she said nervously. "And besides, we're teaching him independence." But when the investigators opened her children's rooms upstairs, with their plush carpets and warm air flowing from the vents, her excuses fell flat. The boy watched from the elderly couple's living room window as more officials arrived. His few belongings were packed into a box, and his precious science books were carefully wrapped in newspaper. For the first time, he felt something beyond cold and hunger. He felt seen. That evening, as he sat warm and safe in the couple's guest room, waiting for his new placement, he heard Mrs. Wilson arguing loudly with the investigators. "I was doing him a favor," she shouted. "Nobody else would take him." But her words didn't hurt like they used to. The warmth of kindness, from Mrs. Wright, from the elderly couple, from people who finally saw and stopped the wrong being done, had started to thaw something frozen inside him. He slept that night in a real bed, under a thick quilt, in a room with actual heating. And though he didn't know where he'd go next, he knew one thing for certain. He would never again accept being treated as less than human. The cold hadn't broken him. It had made him stronger. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. After that cold winter night, the boy found himself sitting in a bright living room, surrounded by moving boxes and the smell of fresh paint. His new foster parents, the Thompsons, weren't anything like Mrs. Wilson. They were a middle-aged couple who'd fostered dozens of kids over 20 years, and from day one, They made one thing clear. In their house, everyone was family. The biggest shock came when Mr. Thompson showed him his room, a real room, upstairs, with 2 windows and a desk that didn't wobble. "Make it your own," he said, handing the boy a box of thumbtacks for hanging posters. "This is your space now." The boy stood there, touching the warm walls, hardly believing it was real. Mrs. Thompson was a high school science teacher, and when she saw his collection of worn science books, her eyes lit up. She started bringing home experiments from her classroom. They built volcanoes in the kitchen, grew crystals in jars, and once turned the garage into a makeshift planetarium. Mr. Thompson, who worked as a carpenter, taught him how to fix things. Together they repaired the desk in his room, and the boy learned that broken things didn't have to stay broken. School became even better. Without the constant stress of the cold basement and hunger, his grades soared. Mrs. Wright visited him in his new home, bringing more books and a proud smile. "I always knew you had it in you," she said, looking around his room filled with science projects and awards. The Thompsons came to every school event, sitting front row at science fairs and academic competitions. When he won first place in the district science fair with a project about thermal insulation, inspired by his basement days, they took the whole family out for ice cream. They didn't call it a foster family, just family. High school brought new challenges, but also new triumphs. The boy who once hid in the library became president of the science club. He started tutoring younger kids, remembering how Mrs. Wright had believed in him. When college applications came around, the Thompsons sat with him night after night, helping him write essays and fill out scholarship forms. The acceptance letters started arriving in spring. Good schools, great schools, and then the letter that changed everything. A full scholarship to medical school. The Thompsons cried when they read it, and for once the boy cried too. Not from cold or hunger or loneliness, but from joy. Graduation day was sunny and warm. The boy, now a young man, stood at the podium as valedictorian. In the audience, he could see the people who'd helped him get there. Mrs. Wright, older but still radiating kindness. The elderly couple who'd saved him that winter morning, now proudly filming with their phone. And the Thompsons, who'd given him more than a home. They'd given him a future. In his speech, he didn't mention the basement, or the cold, or Mrs. Wilson. Instead, he talked about how success isn't just about being smart or working hard. It's about having people who believe in you. He talked about how sometimes the worst experiences can light the way to helping others. And he announced his plan to become a pediatric surgeon, specializing in helping children from underprivileged backgrounds. After the ceremony, as people mingled and took photos, the elderly neighbor couple handed him an envelope. Inside was a photo they'd taken the morning they found him. A shivering boy with blue lips and determination in his eyes. "Keep this," the wife said softly, "so you never forget where you came from, and always remember where you're going." That evening, sitting in the Thompsons' backyard during his graduation party, watching kids from other foster homes playing and laughing, the young man finally felt the last bit of basement cold leave his heart. Looking at his acceptance letter to medical school, he made a promise to himself. Every child he would treat in the future would know what he'd learned, that your start in life doesn't have to be your ending. That warmth can be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the longest, coldest nights lead to the brightest mornings. The boy who once couldn't imagine a future beyond a basement room was now stepping into a future as bright as the stars he'd read about under his thin blanket. And he knew, deep in his heart, that this was just the beginning. 15 years flew by like pages turning in a book. The young boy from the cold basement was now Dr. Thompson. He'd taken his foster parents' name legally after graduating medical school. At just 35, he'd become the youngest chief of pediatric surgery at one of the nation's top children's hospitals, known for taking cases other doctors deemed impossible. His office walls told his story without words. His medical degree hung next to that old first-place science fair ribbon, and on his desk sat the worn science book Mrs. Wright had given him years ago. But what really caught visitors' eyes was the small frame containing a child's drawing of a smiling doctor, with the words, "Thank you for fixing my heart," scrawled in crayon. Each morning, he'd arrive at the hospital before sunrise, just like he used to wake up early in Mrs. Wilson's house. But now, instead of trying to avoid conflict, he used those quiet morning hours to visit his young patients, sitting with them as they faced their own fears. He had a special way with the kids from foster homes. He could spot them instantly, recognizing the look in their eyes that he used to see in his own reflection. "Want to see something cool?" he'd ask, pulling out a pocket microscope he carried just for these moments. Together, they'd look at their own cells, or at the patterns in a leaf, or at tiny crystals forming in a drop of water. Just like Mrs. Wright had done for him, he turned scary hospital rooms into places of wonder and discovery. His reputation grew not just for his surgical skills, but for his unique approach to patient care. He created a program ensuring every child had warm pajamas during their hospital stay. In winter, he personally checked the temperature in every room, remembering those freezing nights in the basement. The hospital staff noticed how he'd often sit with worried parents late into the night, explaining procedures in simple terms until their fears eased. One day, while reviewing upcoming surgeries, he came across a particularly challenging case: a young foster child who needed complex heart surgery. The girl had been bounced between homes, her medical care repeatedly delayed. Without hesitation, he rearranged his schedule to take the case. During pre-op visits, he'd bring her books about the heart, teaching her about what he was going to fix, just like Mrs. Wright had taught him about science. The surgery was scheduled for early winter, around the same time of year he'd been rescued from that cold basement. The night before, he stayed late at the hospital, checking and rechecking everything. A nurse found him sitting in the girl's room, reading her favorite book while she slept. "You can't save them all," she said gently, knowing his tendency to become personally invested. "No," he replied, tucking the blanket around the sleeping child, "but we can make sure they're warm while they heal." The nurse didn't know the full meaning behind his words, but she noticed how he always kept the pediatric ward a few degrees warmer than other departments. His surgical skills became legendary, but it was his small acts of kindness that truly set him apart. He started a foundation that provided educational supplies to foster children. Every Christmas, he organized a massive toy drive, ensuring no child in the system went without a gift. The basement boy, who once had nothing now, spent his free time giving everything he could. During rounds, other doctors marveled at how easily children trusted him. They didn't know about his past, about the cold nights and empty stomach, about the teacher who saved him with books, or the neighbors who saved him with a simple act of kindness. They just saw a brilliant surgeon who seemed to have an almost magical connection with his young patients. The media started noticing too. Medical journals praised his innovative surgical techniques, while local news celebrated his community outreach programs. But he stayed humble, remembering the lessons learned in that basement, that true worth isn't measured by acclaim or success, but by how you help others when they're at their lowest. Late one evening, as he finished his final rounds, he paused by the hospital's huge windows. The city lights sparkled below, and he could see his reflection, a successful doctor in a white coat, standing tall. But in his mind, he could still see that shivering boy, reading by flashlight, dreaming of a warmer future. He'd not only found that warmth, but had become its source for others, turning his pain into purpose, his past into a gift he could share. The morning started like any other at the hospital. The doctor was reviewing his cases when his assistant knocked softly on his office door. "There's an emergency consult," she said, placing a file on his desk. "The patient needs specialized heart surgery, and you're the only one qualified to do it in the region." He opened the file, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The patient's name hit him like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Wilson, age 68. His hands shook slightly as he read through her medical history. She had a rare heart condition that required immediate intervention, and the surgery needed was one he had pioneered. Memories flooded back. The cold basement, the thin blanket, the growling stomach, the frozen fingers trying to hold a pencil. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, his assistant was looking at him with concern. "Everything okay?" she asked. "You've gone pale." "I know this patient," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside. "She was my foster mother years ago." He didn't add, "the one who kept me in a freezing basement." Some pains didn't need words. His assistant's eyes widened. She knew bits and pieces of his story. "Should I refer her to another hospital?" she asked. But they both knew the truth. The nearest surgeon qualified to perform this specific procedure was hundreds of miles away, and Mrs. Wilson's insurance wouldn't cover travel and treatment costs. Looking at her file again, he saw she was living on a fixed income now. Her big house had been sold years ago, and her own children rarely visited. Life had a way of evening things out sometimes. The woman who once controlled every aspect of his life now needed him to survive. He stood up and straightened his white coat. "Schedule her for a consultation," he said. "And please don't tell her my name beforehand. Just list me as the attending surgeon." That afternoon, he walked into the consultation room, clipboard in hand, the perfect picture of professional calm. Mrs. Wilson sat there, looking smaller than he remembered, her once perfect hair now gray and thin. She was studying a medical pamphlet, just as he had once studied his science books by flashlight. When she looked up, the recognition was instant. The pamphlet fell from her hands. It's you," she whispered, her face draining of color. "The boy from the basement," he finished for her, his voice neutral. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. I'm your surgeon." The silence that followed felt heavier than all those winter nights combined. She started to speak several times, but stopped, her hands twisting in her lap. Gone was the confident woman who had once ruled his world with cruel rules and colder smiles. In her place sat someone fragile and afraid. I can't afford to go anywhere else," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "The insurance won't cover it, and my savings." She trailed off, eyes fixed on the floor. He sat down across from her, opening her file with steady hands. For a moment, he thought about that boy in the basement, how he'd dreamed of a day when Mrs. Wilson would need his help, how he'd imagined refusing her with the same coldness she'd shown him. But he wasn't that frightened boy anymore. He was a doctor who had sworn an oath to help those in need. More than that, he was the person Mrs. Wright, the Thompsons, and that elderly couple had taught him to be, someone who chose compassion over revenge. "Let's talk about your heart condition," he said professionally, pulling out a diagram. "The procedure you need is complex, but I've performed it successfully many times." He started explaining the surgery in simple terms, just as he did with all his patients. Mrs. Wilson stared at him, tears forming in her eyes. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why would you help me after what I did?" He paused, looking directly at her for the first time. "Because that cold basement taught me two things, Mrs. Wilson. First, that cruelty can break you or make you stronger. And second, that the best revenge isn't making others feel cold. It's becoming a source of warmth yourself." He turned back to the diagram, continuing his explanation, while Mrs. Wilson sat there, understanding for the first time the true measure of the boy she had tried so hard to break. The days leading up to Mrs. Wilson's surgery were filled with a strange tension. Word had spread through the hospital staff, not about their past, but about how this was one of the most challenging heart procedures their chief surgeon would perform this year. Nobody knew the real story behind the quiet, elderly patient in room 304. The morning of the surgery, the doctor arrived earlier than usual. He found Mrs. Wilson awake, staring out the window at the dawn sky. She looked smaller in the hospital gown, her shoulders hunched against some invisible weight. When she saw him, she tried to speak, but he raised his hand gently. "You don't need to say anything," he said, checking her vital signs. "Just focus on staying calm for the surgery." But she caught his arm, her fingers trembling. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Please." Her voice cracked, so different from the sharp tones he remembered from his childhood. "Last night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that basement, about all the things I did or didn't do." He stood quietly, his stethoscope cold against his neck. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, reminding him of those early mornings when he tried to sneak upstairs for a bit of warmth. "My own children won't speak to me anymore," she continued. "They learned what I did to you, and to the others. They said they couldn't understand how their mother could be so cruel." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Neither can I now. I look back and don't recognize that person." The doctor checked her heart rate on the monitor, his movements practiced and professional. But inside, he felt that small boy stirring, the one who'd wished so many times for just a word of kindness, a moment of warmth. "I used to tell myself I was teaching you to be strong," she said, "that the world was hard and you needed to learn that. But the truth is, I was the one who was weak. Weak enough to hurt a child to make myself feel powerful." A nurse came in with pre-surgery medications, but he waved her away for a moment. This conversation had waited years. It could wait a few minutes more. "The worst part," Mrs. Wilson continued, her voice barely a whisper, "is seeing what you became despite me, not because of me. You turned all that cold into something warm. You help children now, save their lives. While she gestured at herself, at the hospital room, I'm alone with nothing but regret." The doctor adjusted her IV line, thinking about all the times he dreamed of this moment. In those dreams, he'd been angry, triumphant, cold, just as she had been. But standing here now, he felt none of those things. Instead, he felt something unexpected: peace. "Mrs. Wilson," he said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something important." He sat on the edge of her bed, the way he did with all his nervous patience. "When I operate today, I won't be thinking about the basement, or the cold, or the hunger. I'll be thinking about saving your life, because that's who I chose to become." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. "This isn't about forgiveness," he replied, standing up. "It's about breaking cycles. It's about choosing who we want to be every single day." He checked his watch. It was time to prep for surgery. "Now let's focus on fixing your heart, the physical one, at least." As the nurses came in to take her to pre-op, Mrs. Wilson reached for his hand one last time. "You were reading a book," she said suddenly, "that last night in the basement. I saw the light under your door, but didn't say anything. What were you reading?" He smiled slightly. "A book about the human heart. I read that chapter every night until I memorized it. Even then, I knew what I wanted to become." Walking toward the operating room, he thought about that boy with his flashlight, studying the very organ he would now repair. Life had a poetry to it sometimes. How that cold basement had led him here, to this moment, about to use his skills to help the very person who had tried to break him. In the surgical prep room, he took a deep breath and began scrubbing his hands, preparing to do what he did best: heal broken hearts, both literally and figuratively. The surgery lasted 6 hours. The operating room was silent except for the steady beep of monitors and the surgeon's calm voice giving instructions. His hands moved with practiced precision, each motion deliberate and sure. The team watched in awe as he repaired the damaged heart, using the innovative technique he developed. When it was over, after he closed the final suture, he stood for a moment, hands still raised in their sterile gloves. A nurse later said she saw him whisper something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a final release of the past. In recovery, Mrs. Wilson's vital signs were strong. The surgery had been a complete success. He wrote up his notes with the same careful attention he gave all his patients, not letting his personal history affect his professional duty. That evening, as he was preparing to leave, his assistant handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter from Mrs. Wilson, written the night before surgery. His hands shook slightly as he read it. "Dear Doctor, by the time you read this, you will have either saved my life or I will have passed during surgery. Either way, I needed to write these words. That basement wasn't just a dark place for you. It was where my own humanity went to die. Every cold night I forced you to endure killed something in me too. But while my cruelty made me smaller, your strength made you giants. You turned pain into healing, darkness into light. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that the world is better because you survived me." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He walked to the hospital's basement. It was warm there, filled with humming machines and bright lights, nothing like that other basement from long ago. Standing in that clean, well-lit space, he finally let himself feel everything. The cold nights, the hunger, the fear, but also the triumph, the healing, the growth. A week later, Mrs. Wilson was ready for discharge. She would need follow-up care, but her heart was healing well. As he did her final checkup, she asked him a question that surprised him. "What made you decide to become a heart surgeon specifically?" He paused, considering. "Because the heart can heal," he said finally. "No matter how broken it gets, if you give it the right care, the right support, it can become strong again. I learned that from experience, both personal and professional." That same day, he announced a new initiative at the hospital, a program to provide specialized care for foster children, ensuring they never had to wait for necessary medical treatment. The seed money came from his own savings, and he named it after Mrs. Wright, the teacher who had first shown him warmth in a cold world. Months passed. Mrs. Wilson recovered fully, though they never spoke again outside of routine follow-ups. But something had shifted in the universe. Some ancient wound had finally closed. The basement boy and the cold woman had both found their way to healing, though their paths had been very different. One winter morning, exactly a year after the surgery, he stood in his office looking at his wall of achievements. Among the medical degrees and awards, he added something new, that old, worn science book from his basement days. Below it, he placed Mrs. Wilson's letter, framed not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of transformation. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was a social worker with a young patient, a foster child needing heart surgery. As he knelt down to greet the nervous child, he saw himself in those uncertain eyes. Reaching into his desk, he pulled out a children's book about the heart. "Want to learn something amazing?" he asked, opening the book. The child nodded, eyes brightening with interest. And as he began to explain, his voice warm and encouraging, he realized that this was his true legacy, not just fixing hearts, but warming them, one patient at a time. The basement hadn't broken him. The cold hadn't claimed him. Instead, they had forged him into something extraordinary, a healer who understood that sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see, and that the greatest victory isn't in surviving the cold, but in becoming the warmth that others need.